I'm going to read this paper because that's the way I normally do things these days, read it very fast, and I don't use OHPs or images, but every so often I'll stop and give some examples and try and make it quite graphic, and literally try and get through quite a lot in just less than an hour. And just before I start, I should say a couple of things. That, as Kate said, my own work these days straddles two areas. One is very much feminist theory, and the book that I have just finished, and actually why it's slightly difficult for me to make this conceptual leap away from feminist theory into immaterial labour, is because I've just been doing the proofreading for the book that comes out in actually in 3 or 4 weeks' time. I've been doing the final proofreading, and it's on called The Aftermath of Feminism. But the work that I'm presenting today really covers a kind of decade of my own thinking on creative industry, but creative industry with a specific respect to labour. And so I would say that when there is a huge discussion, as I'm sure you're all aware of, around cultural economy, around global creative industries, around, of course, that intersecting with the knowledge economy. And I would say that what has characterized my own work in the last decade has really been an emphasis on labor, and actually on specifically creative labour. What is it to be a fashion designer? So I would say that this paper kind of like allows me to reflect back, particularly on the book that I published in 1998 called British Fashion Design, Rag Trade or Image Industry. And in that book I did, and I have to say I wrote that book sort of really in a bit of a theoretical vacuum. And for that reason it might seem now, looking back at it, relatively under-theorized, because I simply could not find a kind of new hook to connect this work with. It was very much based on interviews with art school trained British fashion designers. And what was really important, I think, to me at the time, was that I was interested in 2 or 3 elements on what we might call microeconomies, on, if you like, small scale cultural entrepreneurs. So I was interested in indie, if you like, indie fashion, in the same way as one might look at indie music as a way of making a living. So this work really came out of my long-term interest, ultimately, I guess, in youth culture, in subcultures, and actually there was a kind of bridging gap between the British fashion design and the earlier work in youth culture from when I was very young. And the bridging gap was a paper that I wrote, which has been reprinted all over the place, and I think it was called something like Second-Hand Dresses in the Role of the Rag Market. And in that paper, which came out in 1989, what I really did there was look at youth cultures as a way of making a living. Yeah? So I was interested in the way in which informal cultural activities began to produce a sort of self-generate their own labour market. So in that paper in 1989, I sort of played about with the idea of subcultural entrepreneurs. And I looked particularly at second-hand clothes markets, and the second-hand clothes markets that mushroomed out of the kind of punk and post-punk movement. And I kind of really insisted in challenging the youth cultural debate at the time, which was very much about the image and about reading the image. And I kind of wanted to say, look here, there is an economy here. There's even a labour market here. There are people who are actually sitting at home, running up these dresses or taking old dresses and then kind of remaking them, putting them through the dry cleaners, and actually then selling them 2 days later. So that really was the kind of the impetus behind the work that I then set about doing in, actually it took me quite a long time to do it, in 1992, which was looking actually at these young fashion designers. And that study, British Fashion Design, really, it kind of in many ways, it reflected what I think was a great moment in British, if you like, cultural production, and which was a moment of kind of indie fashion and indie music, roundabout from 1983 And it really had actually was beginning to fizzle out or be completely corporatized by 10 years later. But I wanted to actually explore the kind of proliferation of microeconomies in every city up and down the UK, where people were making their own clothes and selling them, or where people had done a 2-year course in pattern cutting and then were kind of producing these fabulous clothes and then selling them. So I was interested in this kind of notion of what I called subcultural entrepreneurs. And actually there was also a kind of political rationale under this as well, because I wanted, and this was again what made it, I was kind of, and I think it's worth me saying this, actually. I think I was kind of fighting a battle at that time against the old Marxist left, or the old men of the Marxist left, I should say, who all wanted, and you know, this is like ancient history because so much has happened since then, but I was, the battle I was fighting was one where the old Marxist left, particularly those who were interested in what was beginning to be called culture industry, either thought that these were, as they put it, Thatcher's children, that these were kind of more or less automatically neoconservative young entrepreneurs who were, in a sort of simple way, the products of Thatcherism. So I wanted to challenge that. I just thought this was nonsense. Partly we were, if not teaching these young people, we were coming into contact with them, you know, one way or another. And I wanted to challenge that. And I haven't got time to describe the battles I had, where I was seen then as celebrating or too romantic or all of that stuff, which drove me mad. But the second thing the second battle I was fighting was that these same guys were saying that this was an elite, you know, that this was, and this is an argument that I still think is important to challenge, that the kind of Marxist, post-Marxist left was saying, oh, these are kind of well-qualified, absolutely middle class, you know, what are you on? You know, you're just studying a kind of a tiny emergent fraction of a new elite in the cultural sector. And actually, my research decisively proved that not to be the case. Of course, it wasn't empirical research that was kind of quantitatively verifiable in terms of every art school up and down the country. But what I did in the book British Fashion Design was, I have to say, I did interview every single head of fashion in every single art school in the UK. So I trailed around the UK interviewing these heads of department. And I actually asked them, what is the social constituency of your students? How do students get in to do these kind of fashion courses? Where do they come from? What are their social backgrounds? What do their parents do? And actually, the answer in almost every case was that this was not an elite area of study. In fact, it was an area of study that, thanks to kind of 100 or 200 years of British education, offered pathways through access courses to incredibly modest, people from very modest or low socio-economic classes. That there was absolutely no way that this was an elite education in anything like the normal way. Of course, some fashion colleges became extremely famous, like Central St. Martin's. But actually, even Central St. Martin's, again, where I worked myself, I taught there for 3 years, but also I knew everybody who was teaching there, and I knew the students, and it was a complete myth to say that just because Stella McCartney happened to go there, that was a kind of reflection of the socio-economic background of the students. So the second battle that I was fighting was against the idea that this was a new elite. And actually, I want to stress that again today, because this is quite a vexed question in culture industry debate. You know, what is the status of the new culture industry worker? And I challenge those who say it's simply an elite. At the same time, one of the things that I will be saying today is that when we talk about the new culture industry worker, and I personally prefer, that's a term that I use, to differentiate between people working in IT, people working in... But when I say it's not an elite, I'm aware that it's quite difficult. We're in quite kind of difficult terrain simply because this is now such an expanded category. Yeah? You know, it really is a category that is almost impossible to work with in a straightforward way. When we talk about new media workers, where we talk about people working in high-tech labs, it's very many miles away from people who are working as a freelance, doing some graphic design here and there, and barely making ends meet between jobs. Yeah, so it's very hard to actually kind of address the question of what is the socio-economic constituency of this terrain of workers. And actually what I'm going to be doing today is not saying this is how we can understand, this is how we can break down this, this new workforce, because that's really not my field. I'm going to stick to my focus, which is on these kind of young micro self-employed freelance workers, which is, you know, the kind of I would say my specialism in a sense, and also my emphasis on qualitative interviews as a research strategy with people working in this way. So that's really what I'll be sticking to. But I'm not going to be presenting to you this morning a kind of breakdown of how we understand this new workforce. What I will do is actually try and kind of tear apart or unpick some of the looseness of thinking and some of the kind of baggy thinking that we find in the work of Lazzarato, Virno and Michael Hart. Now, when I say looseness and bagginess, of course, they're doing wonderful theoretical work, which I fully admire. But in that abstraction, I would say that there is a tendency to conflate and to generalize and to really kind of take license or liberties with certain kinds of structural factors, certain kinds of concrete issues that really kind of jump up when you read this. One example I would have is to say, well, can you really compare in this affective labour? Can you really take people working, for example, as air stewards for EasyJet or the cheap airlines? I don't know what they are in the US, but in the UK, we all have to put up with flying on Ryanair or on EasyJet. And I'm constantly fascinated, because I do these trips almost every week, and I'm terribly fascinated by the people who are working in EasyJet and Ryanair, I have to say. 95% female, oh, absolutely working class, all the products of being very made glamorous. And all kind of part of something that is happening to young working class women in the last 10 years. This shift towards work, this shift towards glamorization. And actually in the book that's just coming out very soon, there are about 3 chapters about this in my book, where I argue that, this is slightly to the side, where I argue that instead of being aimed or pushed towards respectability, which is a term that Bev Skeggs uses, if you know Bev Skeggs' works. Instead of being moved towards respectability, young working class women are now being moved towards glamour. Yeah? So glamour becomes the norm of work in this new field of affective labour. Glamour becomes a kind of working part of... Now, I mention that in relation to Michael Hart because it strikes me that really there is a huge gap between these working class girls, often from up north, becoming air stewards and picking up some languages on the way for Ryanair and working long hours on really pretty low pay. There's a mile of difference between them, and then another very obviously kind of affective labour, maybe the most archetypal field of affective labour right now in the UK is the party organiser or the events manager. Yeah? And in another article that I wrote that I think I posted around called Club to Company, I look at the kind of proliferation of new jobs and the emergence really in many ways of the archetypal job in this new economy is the party organiser or the events manager, which is really another way of saying the kind of PR girl. Yeah? Public relations. And if I had a whole team of research assistants, I would be so interested in looking at this field of labour, yeah? And what exactly are the affects that are being deployed. And I would say that there is a kind of class difference, yes? That being a party organiser or an events manager really does require a different level of cultural capital, to use Bourdieu's terms, social capital, from being a girl working on Ryanair. So that's really why I kind of challenge Michael Hart when he shoves not only the equivalent of the girl working for Ryanair and the party organiser, the kind of PR to Stella McCartney or to Kate Moss running around town putting on parties, he also conflates that extraordinarily with people working in health and in education, like so nurses or kind of care workers. And this seems to me like, you know, the question then becomes, well, like, who isn't working in affective labour, really? But at a simple level of kind of practical research, I would say this becomes quite unhelpful. Yes? I mean, is he really just talking about women's work? Yeah? In which case, then we have to begin to kind of break that down, really. And actually, another point that I make in this paper, which I'm just about to start, is that the category of women's work is also a thing of the past. You know, let's do away with the idea of women's work. And in fact, one of my sustained critiques of the Hart, Virno, and Lazzarato work is that when they do, only Hart himself actually refers to women's work, but when they do touch on what we would call women's work, the oddness is that on the one hand, they're all operating with a kind of neo-Marxist Deleuzean framework, but when they talk about women's work, it's kind of oblivious to changes that have taken place, but also oblivious to feminist theory, which has absolutely and completely challenged the idea of the kind of what is the category of women. And what about the fact that gender is in the doing of this work? Yeah? Gender is produced in the doing of having your nails done, yes? So that gender is something which is produced. Consequently, the idea of talking about women's work in this kind of, nevertheless, incredibly up-to-the-moment theoretical framework seems to be another kind of deep problem, yes? One which none of them have addressed. Okay, and just before I'm going to start, I'm thinking about that. Well, there's Michael Hart, there is Lazzarato, and there's Virno. Only Hart talks about gender in his paper Affective Labour, where he does very much draw on, he basically goes back, as I've just said. Surprise, surprise, what does he do? He sort of goes back to domestic labour debate. For those of us old enough to remember the domestic labour debate back in the 70s, this came straight out of kind of Marxist feminism, and it was about how do you value domestic labour? You know, what price do you put on domestic labour? I mean, I actually loved that debate, but it sort of, you know, ran out of steam. But he goes back to domestic labour, and that's what he relies on. Lazzarato and Virno really are kind of completely not tuned into any of these kind of feminist debates at all. But nevertheless, in many ways, I find them actually both more useful. And Lazzarato I find incredibly useful in terms of my own old commitment to, you know, actually Lazzarato offers to me a way of rereading Birmingham cultural studies in a very rich and interesting way that I hadn't really kind of thought of until I read Immaterial Labour. So I think Lazzarato becomes a kind of, to me, a marvellous kind of rapporteur with myself and Dick Hebdage, which we can talk about later, through class struggle and class conflict. I mean, I just think he offers an extraordinarily useful way of rethinking youth culture. So I'm indebted to Lazzarato for that. But Virno, I think, in many ways, actually offers the most useful way of thinking about a new feminist politics, actually, and a kind of dispersed, cooperative politics. And I think that what Virno offers us also is a good way of thinking about mental labour, thinking about the kinds of work that so many young women are now going to be doing, thinking actually about the university and about education, So Verno has kind of no concept of my own kind of pragmatic take on his work. He's not at all thinking about gender, but I find Verno actually incredibly useful in terms of thinking about, well, do we call it the knowledge economy? Do we call it upskilling? Do we call it multi-skilling? Do we actually call it the old British term lifelong learning? Yes. But because he is very concerned with the role of, if you like, education and learning, I find that most useful. Okay, so that's the introduction, and I'm going to. I will actually, I'm not going to read every kind of line of this, but I'm going to kind of like read it and stop every so often. Okay, right, so it's 25 past. I'll take about 10 minutes on each section, and that means that we should finish on time. Okay, this paper offers a feminist perspective on recent debates in what I call new culture industry, particularly where there is a focus on immaterial labour. I'll be dealing with Hart, Lazzarato, and Verno. But what I want to start off by saying is, or what I want to do to begin with, is to pull out from this kind of retrospective on my own work in the last 10 years what seem to me to be the most salient features that are relevant to then an engagement with immaterial labour. And there are three features that I find absolutely determining and defining in relation to looking back at this 10 years of work. Now, first of all, I use the term passionate work rather than affective labour. And from the book, the work I did on fashion, I used the term passionate work because it was the most kind of standard feature of self-definition for these young women, 90% or 95% young women, to say, I'm passionate about my work, or my work is my life, my work is my passion. So I use the term passionate work to refer to work which is described as intensely pleasurable, usually performed by young women, work that is invested with romantic meaning, so the romance of work. And again, this is no doubt what got me into trouble with the old Marxists saying I was too romantic. But with outpourings of emotion manifest in and through the creative process. So looking back at this book, you know, there are endless quotes from young women saying, oh, I stayed up all night to finish this dress, or, you know, I kept going with cups of coffee, or, you know, the sort of idea of like absolute emotional outpouring, or this collection to me reflects my inner feelings about, you know, my childhood. Or, of course, one could say it's also a kind of performativity of emotion, but never mind. With self-surrender to the work itself, including suffering and hardship. Now, what I argued was that I argued that this attachment to work has emerged as a mode, of course, of contemporary self-disciplining. And my focus was on fashion, but I would say the same sensibility could be applied across the world of arts, culture, and media. The affective labour that Hart writes about has actually a very different history. It comes out of a Deleuzian kind of concept of affect, with affect as a kind of bodily pre-subjective intensity, a force which exists prior to meaning and prior to the social relations of power. And that's really quite different from my take on passionate work. So already I would say that there's a difference between affective labour and passionate work. In my work, I drew on the Foucauldian scholar Jacques Donzelot, who wrote a very brief article called Pleasure in Work. And it's a great article. What he says is that, I used Donzelot to present an account of the incitement to take self-actualizing pleasure in one's working life, in this case in fashion, as an example of how biopower operates as labour discipline for young women now entering the world of work with very different expectations from those of previous generations of women. So my argument was that this passionate work was, in many ways, a Foucauldian technology of the self. The subject is expected to find pleasure in working life. So there's a kind of new grid of success and failure. Yeah? That if you don't find pleasure in work, then you fall below the margin of the kind of normative subject. Yes? The subject is now normatively expected to find pleasure in work. For young women working in new culture industry jobs, the valency of emotion and the experience of intensity in the new post-Fordist creative workplace, along with the re-emergence of hierarchies in seemingly flat working environments, and the absence of access to rights in form of employment legislation, and the further side effect of flexibility as gender retraditionalization, which I'll come back to, all of this produces what I would actually say is a multi-layered opacity, a kind of form of illegible labour. So my first claim really is that this new form of working, this passionate work where there is this kind of strong incitement to find pleasure in work and to express your inner self, actually produces a kind of illegible labour. And it's illegible because of these layers of social complexity, largely around the absence or the decline or the erosion of workplace legislation and procedures. So one of the things I'm most interested in is the disappearance of procedures, the end of bureaucracy, the devaluing or indeed the erosion of legislation. And if anything emerges, I think that's like the key feature of my work that I've done since I finished this. What does it mean when the employment legislation that came out of the labour movement for hundreds of years is swept away? You know, what are the emotional anxieties, the pain and the suffering and the injury that accrue in these small organisations when that has when it cannot really be implemented. So I would say that illegible labour is a defining feature in this sector. Young women immerse themselves in their work as though it was a grand affair. The independence and the determination to succeed suggests that impediments of old-fashioned gender inequities have faded away. At any rate, the terms we associate with patterns of gender inequality at work seem not to apply to these fluid, deregulated work environments. When gender issues do appear, they are often unrecognisable or again illegible. Is it because it's me, or is it because I'm a woman? Or is it because I'm in an organisation that really comprises of 6 people who are all freelance? Yes? Or is it that the boss doesn't like me? Or, you know, it becomes utterly illegible. So the gender doesn't seem to emerge as a salient feature. After all, we can assume a kind of normative gender equality in this field. Yes? Feminism is sort of taken into account. So this illegibility has its own logic, since the way in which things do not add up, the seemingly ad hoc or haphazard nature of working on a project-to-project basis, and again I want to flag up, I'm terribly interested in project-to-project working. Yes, this seems to me to be another kind of sociological form that requires a great deal more attention, project-to-project working. The sheer investment of emotion, all of this relies upon a compensatory dazzle, status inflation, that is to say glamour, even when there's no pay, and self-belief, for what are often low-paid jobs in expensive urban locations. So there are 3 key themes that emerge from my own retrospective of this work, and I'm just going to run through the 3 of them, and I'll say a little bit more as I... So the first is an argument really about the requirement for multitasking, because what is clear is, looking back over this work of actually more than 10 years, the unviability of a specialism. Specialisms, or like single skills, become completely unviable. So that to be a fashion designer and nothing else, forget it. Yeah? It absolutely does no longer works. So the unviability over time of, in my case, a pure fashion design specialism, and the need as a result for a broad portfolio, hence the rise of the fashion multitaskers, who can show themselves capable of working in any number of different capacities across the field. This might mean helping out, but actually being a shop assistant, developing new projects which emerge from perceived needs on the part of the sector and which connect directly with the knowledge economy. So, for example, one of the designers that I interviewed, who I'm still in touch with, her worked for about 5 years as a designer, then became a multitasker, and then discovered a kind of niche that indicated a need and that wasn't being fulfilled. So her niche that she then discovered and worked on was to produce, this is clearly how fashion design then becomes part of the knowledge economy, because the niche that she came up with and that she began then to make quite a fair amount of money from was to produce a fashion directory of manufacturing suppliers. Yes? So she actually went round and produced a huge directory of where you can get dresses made in Romania cheaper than where you can get coats made in Latvia. Yes? And she was updating it all the time, and she could afford 2 interns, of course, no pay. And she produced. So this was a kind of good example of moving from somebody who did do her time selling clothes that she had made herself, but then moved into the knowledge economy, really. So this is why my first point is the unviability of a single skill. Another key job in fashion that emerges out of fashion design, which is no longer viable, is the ubiquitous stylist. Yes? So the category of the stylist is another of these jobs that you make up. You know, now it's a norm, but 10 years ago, or doing agency work bookings, being a bookings organizer, working as a consultant, of course, and so on. So the interviews I conducted showed that the ingenuity and emphasis on contacts and networks needed to keep these jobs coming in meant that unfairness, gender or race-related discrimination, or overtly bad practice in the sector was often just put down to experience and ignored. Yes? So the requirement and the ingenuity and the emphasis on social networking meant that bad practice was simply put down to a personal experience. And there was no vocabulary for understanding bad employment practice as in any way to do with the structure of employment or with the abrogation of responsibility of the contractor to implement existing legislation, which did actually exist, you know, which could have been implemented. So the most often the strategy was to walk away from it, having already spent energy and anger in situations where the payment had not arrived months after the job was completed, or the organisation had changed the terms midway through the work. The fashion world, of course, has long been known to operate in these ways, so there was some level of tolerance of bad practice. But gender equalities were often inflected in a kind of post-feminist way. For example, women bosses treating young men more respectfully than their female counterparts. That was a difficult one to kind of, for young women to work their way through. Giving them more work as freelancers, or more complicated and hence better paid work. And so within this landscape of daily stress, these gender issues were often difficult to pin down. That's what I mean. They also became illegible. They would be buried deep inside this whole underbelly of freelance experience. Workplace grievances would not be opened up for discussion, never mind arbitration. They simply meant it was time to leave, time to move on. And this has been the case with every single person I've interviewed, yes? A bad experience which could have been pursued through existing legislation, even legislation for freelancers, was simply put behind the person. It's time to leave. Workplace grievances would not be opened up, but this was usually it meant it was time to leave, usually under a bad cloud of claims and counterclaims. Now, sociologists of small businesses that rely on freelance or casual workers would surely say there is nothing new here at all, and they're probably right. The novelty, perhaps, applies more to the sector itself as art and design, culture and creativity take on the cruel characteristics or the bad intensity of the world of small enterprises. And then we might say that, of course, the world of art and design, culture and creativity have historically been defined within the umbrella of the public sector. So perhaps what we're also talking about here is the way in which the public sector is being corporatized. And in this case, it's being corporatized not along the scales of a large company or a large organization, but rather it's being reduced to a network of privatized microeconomies. Yes, in which case working conditions, of course, are even more likely to reflect this bad practice. So that's the first point. The second feature was that fashion design activity, when it was pursued as a specialism, when there was a determination to fulfill your dream of being the next Stella McCartney, actually emerged as what I would call low capital return work. Yes? So if you like, the specialism where it is pursued actually is a kind of unviable, economically unviable. Now that again is emerged right at the start of the study, where I was interviewing people who were trying to make it alone or in groups, but when they were trying to do their own fashion design, it was low capital return. By which I mean there was an inversion of Ulrich Beck's description of capital without jobs. And what I said was that there were jobs without capital. Yes? Now, this might be also a way of kind of beginning to understand jobs without capital has become the kind of mainstream of the European job creation for graduate schemes. Yes? Jobs without capital, kind of small, freelance, project-to-project working. So Ulrich Beck talked about capital without jobs in terms of the shift towards post-Freudism. And what I'm talking about is jobs without capital. They had little or no investment capital apart from tiny bank loans of £2,000 or support from dear old Prince Charles called the Prince's Trust. As micro-enterprises or freelance outfits, their capacity to manufacture clothes, for example, was extremely limited. And this was, in fact, an integral part of their working practices. So small-scale fashion designers could rarely produce, they could rarely have the capital to produce more than one collection of 20 items, 20 pieces of each item. Yes? So that was the limit of their, if you like, productive capacity all through the years, that they were, nevertheless, making names for themselves, gaining a lot of publicity, being recognized as names, having their names recognized. The reality, nevertheless, was people like Hussein Chalayan, for example, who still kind of has got some existence in this world. The reality was this was jobs without any capital whatsoever, really. It was a kind of, it made even the word micro-enterprise sound rather grand. Over time, this style of independent working was almost inevitably became unsustainable and instead had to become a stepping stone in more diverse activities like the ones I've described above. And actually, I'm just going to stop for a minute to say that what then, the interesting outcome of this was that if you were able to make your name and get your name known, then your name became a kind of micro-brand which then could be used to get other jobs. So in many ways, the actual production work was unsustainable. It was almost like a loss. You had to kind of invest in the loss of what you were making. But if you invested in that loss and your name did get about and you were featured in Elle magazine, or there was a nice piece about you and some pictures of your work across the media, then that became the point at which you could enter into the world of getting more contracts. So that the own production work was a kind of a working loser. Yeah? It was a kind of investment in loss. But in the image economy and in the kind of PR world, that was a kind of it could actually become then a strategy for branding yourself and getting more jobs. And that then, when I kind of followed these people up and I expanded into looking at people who were doing the same kind of work from the arts and in graphic design, what I realized was that all of these young people, young up to the age of 40, I'd say even 45. Okay, so they started off with the idea of they wanted to be a fashion designer, or even, let's say, a filmmaker. That was their personal dream. That was the kind of point of passionate attachment and emotional intensity. That then became completely unviable, but if they could use it in order to get other jobs, that was fine. On the longer term, what emerges is that the own work becomes completely that which is done on a Sunday evening, yes? Or that which is done in the small amounts of leisure time that could be somehow squeezed out of, like, doing 4 or 5 or even 6 jobs. So that the point of passionate attachment, the idea of, like, your own work became a kind of like your own, sort of not just your own brand, it was like your own signature, or it was like what you would refer to if, when you were pitching for work. And in effect, it became what you did for absolutely nothing. Yes? And so, for example, some graphic designers that I interviewed a couple of years ago, and I'll just explain what this meant. What it meant was that they really saw themselves as artists and that they had their own style, their own signature, but they couldn't ever do their own work. They weren't getting exhibitions or shows, so they would be working for corporate, for ad agencies, whatever. However, every so often, maybe once or twice a year, they would invest in, put their own money into doing their own show, which would be a kind of art show. And that would simply be to attract attention to themselves, to have people come and look, to have a party, and as a point of social networking, so that they would keep their own work going on a completely unpaid basis in order to kind of keep their distinctiveness, their kind of auteur status, somehow still in the air, yeah, somehow still. So they had to be able to differentiate themselves from other people, yeah. And they could be doing that, of course, in their daily paid work as a graphic designer, but to really differentiate themselves and to give themselves real cachet, they had to have this kind of notion of their own artwork and where it was going. So the artwork would eventually then appear on a completely self-funded basis. And that really is the same with the fashion designers. Okay. So, given this unsustainability of the old, of the specialism, it had to become a stepping stone into more diverse activities. In the search eventually for security, like after 10 or 15 years, young women fashion designers gravitated to the public sector niche of teaching. Yes? So the public sector also became a kind of pool of gravitation for some kind of security. Ideally teaching. The advantage of this being that payment would be guaranteed and that there might even be some statutory obligations on the part of employers, such as sick pay. This then became the most reliable of the roles tucked inside a single portfolio. Jobs, however, like teaching, were also considered extremely difficult to get. And there was a hierarchy in this kind of work, the best jobs being in prestigious art schools or universities, and the less attractive being in low-level further education courses in fashion retail or in fashion buying, or even working with very disadvantaged antisocial youth. This shift towards the public sector coincided, however, with the semi-privatization of the public sector's own activities in the worlds of art and culture. And by the time the young women had decided to become mentors or arts administrators, these kinds of posts had already been stripped of the welfare benefits such as sick pay and employment status, and so were subject to not dissimilar insecurity as was experienced in the commercial world of project working. So there's a kind of convergence here of work without rights and entitlements. There was something of an irony here. 30 years ago, graduating from art school with a specialism in fashion and textiles for many young women would have been followed by a teaching course, which in turn would have been resulted in a teaching post in a school, a primary school or a secondary school, which would have had all the benefits of the teaching profession, holidays, salary, and so on and so forth. This would have meant, however, being a teacher, but being a teacher does not have the cachet or the status of being a designer. And so the irony is that, to cut a long story short, is that 10 years later, these young women gravitate back to the public sector, become a teacher, but in a much less professional capacity than they would have had if they had become a teacher in the first place. But in their portfolio, they say, oh, I'm a film director, yeah? Or I'm a fashion designer. And I do 4 or 5 days teaching with antisocial kids in the poorest parts of the, on a day-by-day pay basis, yes? So that kind of, that shows you the complications that are going on here. And the third feature I want to focus on is what I call a bypassing mechanism. And this bypassing mechanism impacts on the career trajectories and self-identities in this sector. By this I mean the way in which the structural characteristics of this whole field of new culture industry working are increasingly predicated on mechanisms which allow the usual safeguards against poor practice or discrimination in the workplace to be bypassed and ignored without recrimination. Whether this gives rise to low-level criminality or corruption or not, this possibility is normalized in the everyday working lives of young people. The very idea of challenging a long hours culture is replaced by emotional intensity, by profound attachments, by virtually living the work, by eating, if not sleeping, with the project director. Even sharing houses, incredible intensity. I couldn't believe what I've experienced actually in the last 6 months following up one think tank. There are also incentives to young cultural entrepreneurs to create flexible and informal working environments for themselves so that employment law is irrelevant. Even if in the course of time, new legislation is indeed introduced to protect part-time or casual workers, in the meantime, informal working and network sociality comprise a de facto understanding that there can be no recourse to the law or to an industrial tribunal when things go wrong. So there's a kind of working complicity that industrial tribunals or going to law are absolutely out of the question. And we can talk more about that later in discussion. Bypassing the world of what Ulrich Beck calls normal work means that the new cultural capitalism can almost get away with murder, since the kind of dangers which reappear in old factory-style environments where health and safety regulations no longer apply, i.e. workplace accidents, are now replaced here by health hazards of a different kind. Mental illness, extreme mental illness, burnout, exhaustion, alcoholism, drug-related problems, heart attacks, premature strokes, and so on. It also results in what Scott Lash and Lisa Adkins, both writing separately, called gender retraditionalization. We can talk about that. I actually don't quite agree with either of them, but they use the term gender retraditionalization in the form of a renewed dependency on family and kin, as this becomes once again a unit of production. Lash comments that women were, in a world of reflexive modernization, what he calls reflexivity losers. Now, Scott Lash just says, the great new world of reflexive modernization, and by the way, women are reflexivity losers. And then he goes on to the next thing. But actually, this is quite a significant fact to say that women are reflexivity losers. So, of course, a few of us then follow this up and say, well, what does this mean? I think what it means is not just that the old patterns of gender hierarchy reappear in the form of the husband in what is in effect a family business, both being more active, the husband being more active, being the person who goes out and does the network sociality in the pub or the evenings, which is what Lisa Adkins says. So I think it's not just gender retraditionalization, which would mean a specific gender division of labour where the woman is doing more of the work at home and the man is out in the pub doing the golf course. But what I would say is that, and Kirsten and I have talked about this before, that relations of financial dependence take on new significance. So relations of financial dependence take on new significance in a world where women are, of course, also being geared towards being independent. That some work simply cannot be sustained without the support of a partner. if new culture industry work coincides with the state attempting to unburden itself of responsibility through promoting self-employment in this sector, almost inevitably responsibility falls back on family and kin. It has long been the case that a struggling artist or writer has been dependent on his wife's steady employment to cover the basic bills and the mortgage, but when young women are embarking on these precarious careers, and when it is quite uncertain as to whether or not they will actually secure a viable income, the fact that the state has cut back on benefits and on many other forms of social security, so that unemployment payment barely exists. Okay, this is another point just to make. The unemployment payment really doesn't exist in the UK any longer. And in fact, when people are being interviewed, even in the press, about what they're doing in this world of work, a new category which comes up, which is that I'm between jobs. Yes. So, and that notion of being between jobs simply means that you are in between one project finishing and another one starting. And so there is really no such category as unemployment in this field. Yes? Now, is that because the status, the hype, the emotional intensity, the investment of self is such that being unemployed is an unviable stigma? It's a mark of a kind of a form of inconceivable failure? Or is it because that the landscape of language has been so transformed successfully by new labour that the category of unemployment doesn't exist anymore? Yeah? Of course, it doesn't exist in the UK because you are now a job seeker anyway. Yes? So you're the job seeker's allowance, which really doesn't cover for hardly anything. So the unemployment payments really don't exist. Unemployment payments have no place within this sector, is really what I'm saying. Yes? There is no kind of welfare that kicks in this sector. Absolutely none at all. Yeah? So welfare might as well have been completely done away with in this sector. So I would say that, and when so many creative-related jobs no longer provide security of employment, this introduces a retrograde factor for young women who not only want to be creative, but who also hope to be financially independent. Now, without a lot more data, it's not possible to say anything more than to suggest that the chances are that they actually, over time, become less creative. Yes? So that creativity becomes a complete unsustainable myth. So the idea of be creative is actually predicated on abandoning creativity, because the desire or the need for some kind of steady income prevails, bearing in mind that for this generational cohort of young women, this is a priority, earning a living, then it is likely that artistic independence and creative freedom are jettisoned in favour, eventually, of some form of regular employment. All the more so if the same women embark on motherhood. Okay, I'm just going to finish there, I think, because that's absolutely an hour. We can talk more about Lazzarato, Virno and Hart. I think I kind of covered that in the first 20 minutes anyway. So.